For our first lab, we're just going to introduce to you some of the basic concepts relating to archaeology. The two most important concepts that we need to cover before we get into course content and relate to kind of a typical first lab exercise is understanding what the archaeological record is, understanding what it contains or material culture, and then it's not on this list, but also site types. So as stated here, the archaeological record is a term that archaeologists use to very broadly refer to the body of materials and information that make up the evidence of the past. So archaeology is study of the past via material culture, and so, or we could say it's the study of the past via the archaeological record, right? So what is material culture? Well, we could simply define it as objects that have survived from the past, and we'll talk about that survival process, or what we call preservation. But broadly speaking, material culture is simply just that evidence. Now, there are several categories of evidence or of material culture that we can look at. An important term is that when we refer to kind of a grouping of artifacts or ecofacts, and I'll talk about those in a moment, and structures from a particular time and place within an archaeological site, we refer to that as an assemblage. And so many of the lab assignments you're going to be looking at this term are going to be using data from various assemblages. So of stone tools, of pottery, of faunal remains, or animal bones, or floral remains. So a lot of different kinds of evidence. And what we do is we look at the patterning of those evidence that exist within archaeological sites and between archaeological sites to make our interpretations. So what are the four categories of material culture that we have? Well, let's look at this term of artifacts. Artifacts are anything that are made, shaped, or modified by humans. So you interact with artifacts every single day. We're absolutely surrounded by them. One of the key things that I want to emphasize about artifacts is that, typically speaking, they're small portable items. So I shouldn't say small, but they're definitely portable. And the reason why we refer to them as being portable is that features are also things that are made, used, and modified by humans, but they're non-portable. So while artifacts that you may have in your study environment might include things like pens and markers and pens and your cell phone and paper, features would include facilities or structures, so things like walls, desks, chairs. Classical archaeology ones include burials, hearths, or fireplaces. So hearths don't have to be built structures. They can be like a fire pit, so just stones with some wood in the middle would count as a hearth. Middens. Midden is a term we use in archaeology to refer to garbage sites or dump sites. And of course, middens can be comprised of a whole bunch of different kinds of artifacts. Shell middens are very commonly found in coastal regions or lakeshore regions, and even outhouses. And outhouses might seem kind of gross to think about as something that you'd want to dig up and investigate as an archaeologist, but there's actually a lot of really important information we can obtain from outhouses. Plus, people tend to drop stuff down them quite a bit. Okay, so we have, again, artifacts, anything made, shaped, or modified by humans that are portable. Features, anything made, shaped, or modified by humans that are non-portable. Ecofacts are unmodified natural objects used by humans. Ecofacts are really important for archaeologists, and we'll spend some time talking about them later on in the term because we use them for environmental reconstruction, not just to figure out what the physical environment was like during the time that we're investigating, that we're doing our research on, or we might say during the past more broadly, but also the plant and animal environments that were present as well. So this includes both organic remains, so plants and animals, and inorganic materials, so things like minerals and sediments. Finally, we can talk about fossils, and we often talk about fossils and use it as kind of a catch-all category for things that have been preserved. But fossils very specifically are when we have organic materials that have been replaced by minerals. So when we have the replacement processes or the mineralization or fossilization of bone and teeth. So typically animal and human skeletal materials. It can also include things like impressions, plant impressions. Again, we'll return to this when we look at preservation, but also environmental reconstruction can be really important. Footprints have been really critical in reconstructing human evolution. Okay, So now that we know what the material classes are, we have to start to think about, well, where do we find them? And locations where material culture has been preserved, we refer to as sites. I like this definition from Ember and Peregrine because they take it one step beyond just simply site or locations where material remains have been preserved, but not just where material remains have been preserved, but where we can use them to interpret human activity in such a way, and the preservation has occurred in such a way that anthropologists and archaeologists can recover them, right? So not all sites are created equally, and we'll talk about site formation processes. But more broadly speaking, sites really just are accumulations of artifacts and features. One of the ways that we will distinguish sites is by looking at various site types. Now, I don't expect you to remember all these different site types, but just be familiar that site types range from a single isolated find of an artifact, such as in the upper center location here, where we have a single, this is actually an Acheulean hand axe, here for one of my sites in Tanzania, to very complex city sites, right? So the scale, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, can vary quite significantly. So this is an isolated find site. The majority of sites in Alberta that have been documented, just as a kind of Jeopardy trivia piece of information for you, are isolated finds, and actually some of the oldest sites in Alberta are isolated finds as well. We can have campsites. Campsites are sites where we have separate human activity areas being documented. So this is the very first archaeological site I worked on. It's located in Idaho. And what this picture is capturing is a little excavation trench. In the middle in the circle, that's the remains of a campfire. We've removed the ring of stones that was used to encircle it. We have the white things are bits of shell. We also have some stone artifacts that were used for processing the shell. So we have some very specific activities that are going on here. Someone is having a fire. They were using this fire to cook shell that had been collected down from the river below for their lunch. And then we have stone tools that were also being produced, likely used to help process the shell or extract the shellfish. And then these are mussel shells, and then to make some stone tools likely used in a hunt in subsequent days. So when we talk about activity areas, we're just talking about locations of specific tasks or behaviors, usually focused on a single or limited purpose at a site. So again, stone tool production or pot production, hide working, food preparation, or areas of ceremony. The site types that I'm describing to you here come from a list of Alberta site types, and one of the site types that we find very commonly in Alberta, although these site types are found throughout the world, are stone features. Now, of course, the examples I've given here are global perspectives, but just know that stone features are highly variable, everything from inuksuks to cairns, which are basically piles of stones, to stone circles, of course Stonehenge being one of the most famous. We can have effigies like Great Serpent Mound, which is located in the lower right hand side of your screen, or towards the center. This is like a monkey figure from the Nazca site in Peru. In Alberta, we have tons of medicine wheels. So in this case, we have a central cairn with radiating spokes and then a larger circle that the spokes connect to. And we can have drive lines as well. This image is the earliest known map of head smashed in Buffalo Jump, and leading up to, this isn't Buffalo Jump, this is a pound site, and leading up to the pound where bison were being driven into, there were several stone cairns that lined it. We can have kill sites. So on the left-hand side, these are images from an archaeological site called Bodo. MacEwan has several important contexts, including field placement opportunities for students at Bodo. I worked there as a as a teaching assistant for 2 years, and it was a bison kill site. So we find lots of faunal remains, lots of bones of bison. You can see a bit of a jaw. There's some toe bones, lots of rib fragments and long bone fragments. We can have quarry sites where raw materials have been mined or extracted. This is a very famous site in Egypt where a stone obelisk was being extracted from the stone quarry, but the workers, for whatever reason, never completed the project. We can have workshops. I've already mentioned these areas where production has occurred. And we usually distinguish workshops from a campsite or a homestead site because there's no other indication of cultural activity. So in this image here, we have a bunch of individuals making stone tools, and the only activity that they're engaged in here is stone tool production. We can have rock art sites. So in the upper left-hand side, we have some petroglyphs from Writing on Stone National Park, found here in southern Alberta. And petroglyph sites are where the designs have been pecked, carved, etched, incised, ground, or rubbed directly into the natural rock surface. Whereas pictograph sites, such as this Upper Paleolithic site in France, or this Aboriginal site from Australia, show we have images of either bears or an anthropomorphic figure or human-like figure that have been painted on the rock surface. Those might be what you think of when the site or the term archaeological site comes to mind, but we also have more recent or contemporary sites. Homesteading and agricultural sites are a common feature found across the Albertan landscape. On the left-hand side here, this is Vogel's meat packing plant. This was a site I helped excavate with some students from MacEwan University in 2017. And so this abattoir or meat packing site or industrial site was located in the Mill Creek Ravine. So while it's a naturalized area today that you can hike and ride your bike through or walk your dogs in, 100 years ago, it had a major meat packing site. Actually, it had 3 of them that were located throughout of it. And of course, we can also think about trading posts or fortifications such as Fort Edmonton. We can also have cultural heritage sites. These include things like traditional land use locations like trap lines and berry picking patches, pack trails, etc. Culturally modified trees are very commonly found throughout northern Alberta and British Columbia. This is where usually the bark of the tree has been stripped away, and people in the past used this for wayfinding measures, basically signposts through heavily forested regions. But other locations, parts of the landscape that we might think of as natural features, have cultural significance as well. Niagara Falls is one of the most important and significant waterfall sites in Ontario for Indigenous groups in the region, particularly the Anishinaabe people. But it's also, of course, a very popular tourist destination today. So this is a cultural heritage site. Hunting lodges and seasonal camps may be this. Of course, any site where we, again, have the remains of past human activity preserved is a site, right? It's all about how we define it. It's all about the temporal restrictions that we place on it. Okay, so I'm going to pop out of this slideshow now, and I'm just going to show you our first exercise for this week. So this is not one that we expect you to hand in, but it's just getting you to think about archaeology. So the handout begins with just an overview of some of the basic information pieces regarding to the lab, including what the lab schedule looks like, the topics and the readings associated with it, how your lab grade will be evaluated. And then I've introduced you some of the specific lab policies, and then anthropology lab space rules and access regulations. So these are just meant to supplement the general lab safety course that you've already taken or will be taking by September 18th. Then I just have 2 simple exercises for you that I'd like you to undertake, and then we'll talk about these in our next Blackboard Collaborate session. So the first is classifying material culture. So I want you to start to familiarize yourself with the terminology we use in archaeology by describing objects that are very familiar to you. Again, things that are in your environment. So this could be your house, your workplace, your study space. It could be objects that you carry on you in your purse, your backpack, your pockets, etc. Okay, so it doesn't matter which objects you select. I recommended about 10 objects, and then fill out this table, and I've given you some tips to do that. Once you've completed this activity where there's 2 different tables, where first you're going to just basically describe selected objects that you found, then you're going to start to classify them into various types based on their characteristics or their attributes. And then I have some discussion questions for you. And again, these will go over in our Blackboard Collaborate session next week. The next thing we're going to do, or I would like you to do then, is look at this object here, our mystery object or our thingamajig, and I would like you to consider it. I'd like you to answer some questions about this object, because the reality is in many archaeological sites, the material culture we encounter is not something we're familiar with. The sites that I've largely worked on in my career are Middle Stone Age and Upper Stone Age later Stone Age archaeological sites from Tanzania. So these date anywhere between 300,000 and 4,000 years ago. So of course the material culture that was produced by people during that time period is significantly different from that occupies our spaces today. So one of the things we have to do as archaeologists is learn how to approach objects that we cannot readily identify. So you're going to fill out the table, again, just describing some of the key attributes or traits, and then I would like you to ask the questions. And I'll just strongly encourage you to conclude that you don't just do a Google image reverse search on this object. That's no fun. It's really fun just to start to think about, okay, what could this object be? What are the attributes I see? What things do I observe about it that might tell me something about how it was used, what its purpose was for, and who might have owned it? So don't take the easy way out. Don't just Google the image. Really think about it, and then we'll talk about it on Blackboard Collaborate next week. So I hope that this overview to the lab for the week 1 topic really helped, and we'll see you shortly.